I was doing some research ahead of time about the types of things people struggle with, are interested in. And I actually did some research into what people are Googling the most. And it's interesting that people are Googling the most when it comes to weight loss. Can you guess what it is?
Ketogenic diet?
Well, even more than that is how to lose belly fat.
Oh, interesting.
And it's not so that people are really, really obsessed with losing this fat right here. And I think there's some exercises out there and some diets that purport to be able to help you lose just targeted fat in this region. What do you say to that?
The answer is you may be able to spot reduce, but I think practically it's kind of irrelevant, and I'll explain why. So first of all, the question is that visceral or liver fat, or is that just where you tend to store subcutaneous fat? And that's hard to know unless somebody's done like an MRI and that sort of thing. Because some people just store their subcutaneous fat in different areas, right? Like some people tend to have it more in their legs, like women in particular, if they store it, they tend to store more in their legs, whereas men tend to store it more here.
What's the difference between subcutaneous and visceral?
So visceral is the viscera around the organs.
Okay.
Visceral fat and liver fat are gram for gram far more metabolically unhealthy than subcutaneous fat.
Okay.
So that's the point of differentiation. But the stuff that causes you to lose subcutaneous fat, which is the fat under the skin, is the same stuff that typically helps you lose liver fat or visceral fat. So one of the things I tell people, if we're talking about trying to lose body fat or trying to get any big health outcome, let's pick up, if we're going to try to pick up as much in weight of boulders as we can, you're going to focus on the big rocks first, right? And then if you got the big rocks, you can worry about picking up some pebbles. But don't drop the big rocks to pick up the pebbles. And I think a lot of people end up doing that. So before you go into some very specific protocol on trying to lose, belly fat, go back, zoom out. Can I sustain this long term? Because if you can't sustain it long term, it's not really going to matter. You're better off finding something that you can sustainably do, consistently execute long term, because if you lose enough overall body fat, eventually you will lose the belly fat. And I mean, part of it is just our genetics and how we store.
It seems really stubborn though. It seems like, for me, it feels like it's the last thing to go.
I will say they've shown that exercise specifically can help target liver and visceral fat even without a calorie deficit. So even if people maintain their body weight, they tend to lose liver and visceral fat just through exercise.
So let's talk about exercise and weight loss. So
hot topic,
very hot topic. I would love an answer here on, one school of thought is that exercise isn't particularly useful for weight loss because if I go out for a run, I then come home and I just eat more. And this is kind of a multifaceted issue in the sense that there's a biochemical component to that hypothesis, i.e. my brain produces more of the hunger hormone, so I get more hungry. But then there's also a psychological part to that hypothesis where people say it's actually because I went for a run, so I think I deserve more food. So then I eat more cake because I feel good about myself.
So this is where the way the study is conducted really matters. So let's take it mechanistically first. If we look at tightly controlled studies where they have people exercise and they're having them, eat the same amount of calories versus people that don't, exercise absolutely helps with weight loss. Absolutely. The hunger side is a little more complex. So first off, there's a compensation of exercise where Herman Ponsard did this research, basically showing that if you burn 100 calories from activity, you don't net 100 calories of loss. Your body actually compensates by your BMR reducing a little bit, or you become maybe a little bit less spontaneously active, right? So there's a partial compensation, but on average, again, everybody's different, but on average, it's about 28 calories per 100 calories. So if you do 100 calories of activity, you're still netting 72. It's just not as much as you thought you were going to get, right? So there's that aspect to it, that exercise doesn't cause the amount of weight loss that you might predict based on how much you do, right? But it still contributes to energy expenditure. The more interesting thing is what you touched on, which is intake, which is actually counterintuitive to what you think. On average, in the studies, yes, people tend to eat a little bit more, but the compensation is not nearly complete. Okay? So, exercise on the net actually has an anorectic effect. Now, I'm not saying for every person. There are some people who, whether it's psychological or it actually is physiological, they exercise more and they do feel more hunger, right? But on average, in the studies, exercise either has a neutral or positive effect on appetite. And there actually is one classic study from the 1950s, I reference it in the book, where they looked at Bengali workers and they didn't have an intervention, but they just looked at sedentary, lightly active, moderately active, very heavily active, right? So think heavy construction labor workers. And from lightly active to heavily active, they almost perfectly compensated their energy intake, right?
By eating more food.
By eating more to match the activity, right?
Yep.
Just intuitively. The sedentary people ate more than the lightly active, and if I recall correctly, about the same, maybe a little bit more than the moderately active folks. Being sedentary actually dysregulates your appetite. When you are active, it actually sensitizes you to your body's own satiety signals. They work better. So I actually think the main benefit of exercise for weight loss isn't because you burn so many calories. It's one, because exercise helps with lean mass retention, which we know that the more lean mass you have, higher energy expenditure, and it also helps prevent weight regain. So that's one aspect. But the actual amount of calories you expend in exercise, I mean, if you look at the actual research literature, it's not that much. I mean, you go to the gym for 2 hours, you might burn 500 calories, something like that.
Half my salad.
Right. Like you eat a donut, boom, gone, right? But people tend to have better appetite regulation when they exercise, when they're active. There's multiple components to it. Like I said, better sensitivity to satiety signals, but then the psychological aspect of goes the other way.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people who say, well, I'm exercising, I'm going to eat this. But other people exercise and they actually, all their habits start to get better. Right?
I'm one of those people as well.
Right.
I always say, if I want to fix my diet, I need to go to the gym.
Right.
I always say that because when I said it to, I think some of my friends in my team the other day, if I'm going to go and work out for an hour and I'm going to go do a HIIT workout for an hour, for example, it's so painful that the last thing I want to do is throw it all away with like a fucking Krispy Kreme. So my diet then falls in place suddenly. And that's always, whenever I go through a moment in my life where I'm like, Steve, you've lost control of your diet here. It's how can I get myself to the gym as the catalyst to, get my diet in order.
And that's the problem with a lot of, not the problem, but just the limitation of a lot of studies, which is, especially like epidemiology. And when I say epidemiology, it's like this group does this, and we're looking at what other things happen. Yeah. Well, people don't do things in isolation, right? So you'll hear a study like I'm thinking of something. People who eat more protein have higher rates of this. Okay, well, if we look at where most people get their protein sources in the Western world, it's highly processed, energy-dense foods. Protein tends to just be a proxy for overall more calories. And so is it the protein or is it all the calories they're taking in, right? And again, people, their lifestyles and habits tend to go together, right? Like you hear X group was more prone to heart disease, but then they also tend to smoke more, drink more alcohol. Like it is very difficult to disconnect those habits and those lifestyle habits, right? They call it healthy user bias in studies. Mm-hmm. It's one of the things we have difficulty with, and that's why, again, human randomized control trials are kind of our gold standard, because I think this is important to touch on the word randomized. Okay, so if we're talking about epidemiology or cohort studies, so cohort is a little bit better than your standard epidemiology because they're taking groups of people and they're following them for years. So each person is kind of their own control, right? Mm-hmm. But still, people who are more healthy tend to do more overall healthy things. People who are more unhealthy tend to do more. It's hard to disconnect those two. But when you do a study and you say, okay, one group is going to do a low carb diet, one group's going to do a low fat diet, and we're going to randomize them, right? Why is that important? Well, what if we let people self-select? Okay, well, if they just say, you go whichever group you want. Well, and I'm just speculating, right? But for example, low-carb diet's very hot right now. A lot of people may have a very strong proclivity to go to that group thinking it's healthier, having a more positive viewpoint of it, and they may clean up a lot more other aspects of their life. But if we randomize, what we can assume through that randomization process is that any inherent characteristics of the subjects are going to be equally distributed amongst the groups. And that is why that's so important. And I remember I was listening to a breakdown on a podcast one time, and they were discussing a study that was looking at they were looking at intermittent fasting versus continuous energy restriction, so just normal dieting. And basically the crux of the study was they found no real difference in weight loss. And the person on there was a very pro intermittent fasting person. They said, well, how, they don't know. Maybe the one group was eating a bunch of junk food or whatever. And I'm thinking, this person doesn't understand randomization, right? Like that would be a very odd thing to just, it actually would lead you to the conclusion that intermittent fasting might cause you to seek out junk food, right? So again, randomization is not perfect, but the reason it's so important is because it helps us get rid of that healthy user bias. And I think, again, but the downside to randomized control trials is you can only run them for so long because they're controlled.
Is your view on keto the same as you kind of said about all diets, or does keto stand in a bucket of its own? And I ask this in part because a lot of doctors kind of prescribe keto as a diet for certain people that have epilepsy and certain types of inflammation and brain-related issues.
Okay, so epilepsy is a specific case. Essentially, for epilepsy, ketogenic diet is actually a very effective treatment. It provides a usable substrate, ketones, for the brain, and they see it decrease the incidence of epilepsy. In fact, my friend that I've referenced, Dom D'Agostino, he actually started studying the ketogenic diet as for deep water Navy SEAL divers, because a lot of those divers at depth get seizures. And they found that doing the ketogenic diet helped reduce those seizures. Now, unfortunately, people have taken that to say, well, any brain problem, just give them the keto diet. There's way less evidence to support it for other brain problems. But let's talk about, there's a lot of claims around the keto diet, low carb diets. It seems to function for fat loss the same way as other diets, through a calorie deficit. There have been several really well done randomized control trials, as well as a couple of meta-analyses now. If they compare diets that are equal in calories and protein, but vary the carbohydrate and fat amount, anywhere from low fat, high carb to low carb, high fat, no real differences in weight loss or fat loss. In fact, the meta-analysis showed it slightly favored low-fat diets, but it was a really non-clinically significant amount. But how can that be? Because one of the things people say, well, when you do a keto diet, you burn way more fat. So I think if there's one soundbite that might, make it, this might be it. So yes, you do burn more fat on a ketogenic diet. Why? Well, when you do a ketogenic diet, you're eating higher fat, lower carb. So you're eating more fat, you have more fat substrate to burn, but also you're keeping insulin low. And so you burn more fat because insulin reduces your rate of fat oxidation and reduces lipolysis. So people take that and they go, well, it's better, right? So here's where we're getting into, we were talking earlier about mechanisms versus outcomes, right? But when we look at these studies where they actually measure the outcome of fat loss, they don't see differences between low carb and low fat. How? If they're burning this much more fat. Fat loss and fat burning or fat oxidation are not the same thing. Fat oxidation is part of fat loss, but it's only one side of the coin. So fat, whether you lose or gain fat, is fat balance. You are always storing and burning fat simultaneously, okay? On a low carb, high fat diet, you are burning a lot of fat, but you're also storing a lot of fat. And here's why. Carbohydrate really isn't stored as body fat. Your body almost exclusively has to burn it when you take it in. They did a metabolic tracer study where they basically labeled carbohydrates and fats. You can label them with a stable isotope. and you look at where the label winds up, right? Less than 2% of the fat stored in adipose in a mixed diet originated as carbohydrate.
What's adipose?
Fat cells.
Okay.
Over 98% came from dietary fat. So here's the rub. If you are doing a low fat, high carb diet, you're not burning much fat, but you're not storing much fat either. If you're doing a low carb, high fat diet, you're burning a lot of fat, but you're also storing a lot of fat. So what actually matters in terms of fat balance is energy balance. Are you eating more calories than you're burning? That is what will end up dictating that. And that's why we just don't see differences in actual loss of body fat between those groups. But again, so this is where we got into earlier before we started the cameras. A lot of people get very focused on these biochemical mechanisms. And one of the things, I was that way when I was an undergrad in biochemistry. And I think doing that first was great. Doing biochemistry first was great. And then going to nutrition and having a good advisor who zoomed me out and said, hey, you're pretty far in the weeds. Zoom back out and look at the whole picture, okay? Because mechanisms are great. It's good to ask questions. When we see an outcome, and when I say outcome, fat loss would be an outcome, actual loss of body fat, a change in HbA1c, a biomarker, that's an outcome, right? If there's an outcome, there will be a mechanism to support that outcome. But just because there's a mechanism doesn't mean there's an outcome. And what I mean by that is all these biochemical pathways, these mechanisms, this is a symphony. And when you do one thing someplace, a lot of times it's compensated someplace else, okay? An outcome is the summation of hundreds, if not thousands, of different biochemical pathways coming together. And the example I used with you earlier was getting focused on mechanisms is like looking at a mutual fund and getting focused on the individual stocks in it, right? And saying, woo, don't invest in that mutual fund. Look at those two stocks that are down by 40%. But why do I care if the overall mutual fund's up by 20%? I care about the overall. That's the outcome. And so I'm not against necessarily looking at mechanisms, but I'm always going to go to first, okay, do we actually have human trials that are measuring the thing that we care about? Not a proxy measure, but the actual thing. And if I can invoke a former episode on here, if that's okay.
Please.
Somebody said, well, be careful drinking caffeine because it stimulates cortisol release and that can cause you to store belly fat. So that's a mechanism, right? If you look at the actual outcome data in terms of body fat and visceral fat or liver fat with caffeine, you actually see a neutral positive effect. So, okay, maybe that small increase in cortisol, maybe that's a negative. But if caffeine's also stimulating your BMR and also possibly doing some other things like increasing fat oxidation, okay, maybe there is that negative component to it, but it's obviously outweighed by the positive components that end up in the outcome that we're looking at, right?
So without being scientists and being able to understand all of the little instruments in the orchestra.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what we try and do sometimes. We try and figure out all the little instruments in the orchestra, but really you're saying, listen to the music.
Listen to the music.
And listening to the music in that analogy would be like looking at the scales, or would be just looking for the outcomes?
The outcome.
And also, I guess one thing more would be this point about consistency and sustainability, because like we all have a bias to want big rewards for small investment. And that sells, right? 5-minute abs. That's what we want.
Complete physique overhaul in 6 weeks. Add an inch to your arms in 12 weeks.
What I'm really fascinated by is what it takes at a psychology level. And we kind of talked about it already because we talked about your why and all these things. But you can say that. You can say to someone like me in business, it's going to take you 10 years to get there, or it's going to take you 10 years to become the world record holder in this powerlifting activity. But for someone to say, yep, fine. They're going to have to be a little bit, dare I say, twisted. They're going to have to be a little bit.
It is the ability, I think one of the most underrated things is the ability to delay gratification, right? And not in all areas of my life, but in that particular area, I'm really good at it. And
I wonder how much of a choice you had at a deep level.
you know, it's interesting. I told the story of how squatting was hard for me. I had been training hard for 3 years, and I had like these chicken legs. I used to get made fun of on the bodybuilding forums so bad. And I remember thinking 3-4 years in, I'm like, man, people was like, dude, your genetics suck. Like, why are you going to keep doing this? And it's kind of the let's find out thing. I remember literally having this internal dialogue of, you know, maybe they never will be big, but I'm going to commit myself to training hard consistently for 10 years. And if I don't have a decent set of legs at that time, then I'll allow myself to quit if I still feel that way. And I always say paralysis by analysis and perfectionism has killed more dreams than failure ever could. Because one of the worst things you can do is have no action. Inaction is way worse than failure. Because if you fail, at least you can learn something from it. You try stuff. I'm sure as an entrepreneur, you've had a lot of stuff fail, right? But you learn from that and you go, okay, well, that didn't work. We'll try this. And eventually, if you're trying enough stuff and you're walking the path, it may not have worked out the way you drew it up, but you get something better than what you started with, right? Maybe not exactly what you wanted. Maybe you get something better though. And I'll tell people that's why action is so much more important than trying to get everything laid out perfectly. Just start where you are right now, as imperfect as it is. Start walking the path. And if you are walking the path, you're going to screw up. Learn from it and do better the next time. And eventually, again, maybe you don't get exactly what you want, but I bet you get something pretty good.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.